Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm Steve Doyle, and I'm your host. We have a great show today. We are going to be talking to Carlina de la Cova, who is a Sherlockian with a very interesting profession and background. And we're going to be speaking at length to her about the intersection of her vocation and her avocation, the intersection of her interest in Sherlock Holmes with her profession. And it's going to be great. I want to also share some of the feedback that we've got. We've gotten comments at the end of our last show. I mentioned that if anybody had any questions or comments or feedback they wanted to share, that we would be grateful to hear it. We got a couple of very nice comments here I want to share. One correspondent writes, "Thanks for the podcast. I am learning so much." That is very gratifying. That is a goal of this effort, is to sort of share with us this sort of rich history that we share in our Sherlockian community, particularly with those who are newer or just have not had an opportunity to pick it up. Another comment was, "Looking forward to many more episodes. Well done, chaps." And I'm very grateful for that too. We have a long list of people that we want to talk about, a long list of subjects that we want to explore, and it's your encouragement that I think will keep us on that path. So I want to, without much more delay, I want to welcome Carlina de la Cova to our show. Hi, Carlina. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Well, thanks for being with us. It's good to see you. You know, we've all been sort of isolated for a while, and it's even virtually, it's kind of nice to see our friends' faces and talk. That was one of the motivations for doing this, actually, was to sort of reach out and you know, connect with our friends and share conversation and that sort of thing. So
it's good to physically see you too. You're looking a little bit more alive than I am. So
I was outside today. It's very warm here today, so
okay.
I don't know how good I look. Anyway, so I thought we'd start today, and just, I know that you're getting better known in the Sherlockian community, but so let's just do a little introduction. So, Carlina, where do you live? Where are you?
So I live in South Carolina. Let me put on my best Southern accent for y'all. I shed it. I have like 3 accents that, from childhood that I toggled back and forth between because, I was born in Jacksonville, Florida, but my dad lived in New York City. So in the summers, I would go see him in New York, and you got a little genteel accent like really fast. No, I live in Columbia, South Carolina, just actually outside of Columbia, more in a rural area over in Lexington County. It's hot, it's humid, it's raining a lot right now, and I'm sure you've seen us on the news for a plethora of things throughout time in regard to history.
Yes, I have been seeing South Carolina. That's true.
It's right. Very different from Indiana, and I lived in Indiana for 10 years.
So what is your profession now? What do you do? I know what you do, but tell our audience what you do, which I actually just find very interesting.
In terms of teaching, or in terms of the whole kit and caboodle?
Well, I know that you teach. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about that, and then we can kind of talk about the bigger picture too.
Okay, so I'm an associate professor of anthropology here at the University of South Carolina, and I teach courses on anthropology. I'm a biological anthropologist by training. So what that means is that I study literally human biology within the context of culture and environment. But I'm also trained in forensic anthropology, which is something else that I do as a service to the community. So I'm actually a deputy coroner as well, and I do work on forensics cases. And I teach a course on the forensics of Sherlock Holmes, which looks at It's literally an introduction to forensic science through the lens of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and then bringing the students forward into the present using the Sherlock Holmes stories as a basis to get at the history of forensic science and also early anthropological thought, because early anthropological thought, anthropology, and archaeology really permeate the canon. So all the Sherlock Holmes stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle have a touch of anthropology. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself would have been familiar with anthropology and known anthropology as a physician, a doctor who was trained in medicine and anatomy in the 19th century, because my discipline, my subdiscipline of anthropology, biological anthropology, is born out of medicine, actually.
For those of us who might not know, can you define anthropology?
So anthropology is essentially the study of human beings through time and space, if we want to get sci-fi about it. Some of my colleagues might cringe about that, but that is truly what it is. Anthropologists essentially study people, both past, present, and somewhere along the middle. It encompasses the evolution of humankind, the evolution of culture, human cultures across the globe, how humans interact with their environment, what, in terms of their culture, influences their interactions with their environments. Language as well, and linguistics is part of, it's one of the 4 subfields of anthropology. So anthropology has 4 subfields. Linguistics is one, the study of language. Cultural anthropology is another one. The study of society. One is archaeology. You all know archaeology thanks to Indiana Jones. I'm sorry, real archaeology isn't like that.
Darn it.
And then the 4th one is biological.
On my fedora.
I have one upstairs, actually. So, yeah.
And then, so what is forensic anthropology?
So forensic anthropology, whenever you see the term forensic in front of anything, that means the application of the law or the legal system, if you will, to that particular field of study. So forensic anthropology is literally the application of the law to anthropology. That's the long professional definition. Really, if you watch the show Bones, that's what forensic anthropology is, and that's sort of the way we define it to the public. But then we go and we dismantle, in terms of the public, how what we do is different from Bones. So say you find a skeleton in your backyard. What's the first thing you do other than say, oh my gosh, there's a skeleton in my backyard? Wow, how'd that happen?
What is this?
Right. The next thing you do is you hopefully call the police, right? So your first responder from local law enforcement comes out in his cruiser. He or she will look at it, and then he or she contacts the coroner. And then the coroner has a look at it, or the medical examiner, and then the medical examiner says, okay, this is outside of my realm if I don't have any anthropological training, so I'm going to contact a forensic anthropologist. So the forensic anthropologist is the one who excavates the remains. And I refer to all my individuals as opposed to skeletal remains. That's just my ethical practice of doing things. So we excavate the individual because we don't know if there are artifacts or things that are associated with the individual that can give us a time of death. So think of things like coins, buttons, clothing, any evidence of that, bullet fragments, if they're not lodged in the skull, if it's a gunshot wound. And so we excavate the individual, and then we take the individual back to the lab, and we're the ones that essentially do the profile. We determine the age of the individual based on what we know about skeletal anatomy. We determine the height or the stature of the individual. We determine as best as we can the ancestry of the individual. And this has become a little bit more contentious as time forward because of gene flow between different groups and populations. So it's not static. It's not like doing physical or forensic anthropology in like 1955 or 1956. It gets harder and harder to assess ancestry. So there are mathematical models that we can use to do that. We measure skulls, and just like Dr. Mortimer, unfortunately, in The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Right.
to,
This isn't like phrenology, right? I mean, it's not.
No.
Not
But
that, right?
but here's the interesting thing about phrenology. Phrenology actually, in some respects, phrenology, you're touching bumps on the head, right? But then you're linking those bumps to actual aspects of behavior. Well, some of those bumps that you're touching on the head are actually bumps that help us determine whether or not someone is male or female today. So
Wow.
yeah, so there is, so some, not all those bumps, just some of them. So if you think about the base of the skull back here and the way that it might stick out and how robust or musculature-y it looks, and that's not a scientific word, but musculature-y. So ancestry, so possible cause of death, that we can't always determine. I mean, it has to be radical, like I'm talking, there has to be, a gunshot wound, there has to be some form of blunt force trauma, and that sort of thing, or some sort of evidence of pathology that would have caused death. Whatever else we can determine, anything that can give the detectives that we're working with and the team that we're working with the identity of this particular individual.
Really so interesting. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how you found Sherlock Holmes. It sounds like you have a natural inclination toward this sort of thing. So when did you find Sherlock Holmes, and what was the attraction? I think I know, but what was the
Well, I found Sherlock Holmes twice, and I know I've written about this. I found him twice. The first time he was forced upon me in junior high, and it was the Speckled Band. We had to read the Speckled Band for English. And then we watched, at that time, the Granada series was still rolling. And so we watched the Speckled Band, Jeremy Brett's Sherlock Holmes. And I was really captivated. I was captivated. I remember being captivated by the character. And I think Jeremy Brett really brought him to life. Although, believe it or not, Jeremy Brett's not my favorite Sherlock Holmes, right? But
who is?
Peter Cushing.
Oh, well, he's great. He's a good.
I know. I mean, I grew up on Hammer horror films, like as a young tween. That's the term we want to use in teens.
Singing my song. Love that stuff. He's a great Sherlock Holmes, I think.
He is, and I think sometimes people see Sherlock Holmes as being extraordinarily serious. And the thing that I liked about Peter Cushing that I don't think any actor has captured to this day, and each actor brings something new to, I think, the character, and each actor captures certain aspects of the character. Even Robert Downey Jr.
Mm-hmm.
Some people are cringing when they hear this, but if we step back and really think about it, he captures something from the stories, even if it's just that big.
Oh, I agree. Yes, I know exactly what you mean.
And for me, Peter captured that underlying sense of humor I always sense from Sherlock Holmes, and that nervous energy, like this snake that's coiled and ready to strike.
Kind of high pitched.
Captured that really well. But so anyway, so that's the first time I met Holmes was in junior high, and I was captivated by how he could make assessments for things that were commonplace in the environment every day, but he could see through observation the slightest things that were off tick and bring it together in a sort of pattern. But I found Stephen King. I found Stephen King shortly after I found Sherlock Holmes, and I deviated towards Stephen King and Pet Sematary and Misery and The Stand. And I know I was in junior high reading these things. Even my geography teacher was like, "You shouldn't be reading that." And I was like, "My mom doesn't say I can't read this."
Late, I already am.
Right. So fast forward to about, what was this, that was 7th or 8th grade. So fast forward to about 10th grade, 9th or 10th grade, maybe. And I was at our local antiquarian bookstore, the San Marco bookstore in San Marco Square.
Where was San Marco Square?
So San Marcos Square is in Jacksonville, Florida. It's on the
Okay.
south side of Jacksonville, and it's in San Marco, which is a suburb, one of the older suburbs of Jacksonville, and very vibrant theater and whatnot. And I was at the San Marco bookstore, which was an antiquarian. I can't say the word today.
An aquarium.
An aquarian
Yes.
bookstore.
Mhm.
And I was looking for comics, and it just so happens that their comics are on the floor, right? Above the mystery and fiction and classic sections.
They put them down low where the kids are.
You're right. It's clever. And so I was looking for comics. I can't even remember what comics I was looking for. I think it's Superman. I don't know, maybe Superman, Batman, Daredevil. I happened to look up and I saw this it's like gilded gold lettering, and it said, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And it was about that thick. It was the Reader's Digest edition.
Oh, sure.
And there was The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and The Hound of the Baskervilles and The Study in Scarlet, because The Study in Scarlet was bundled with The Hound of the Baskervilles. And so I said, okay, I'll grab The Hound of the Baskervilles. I remember Sherlock Holmes from school. So I grabbed The Hound and A Study in Scarlet, walked out the door with it. Within the week, went back, got The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and then it just took off from there. And since the Granada series was still running, I par on par with the stories in Jeremy Brett's depiction. And because A&E had them running nonstop sometimes on the weekends, I could play catch up and then see the new episodes on PBS. I feel really old saying that now.
I know what you mean. But it's almost people who, newer Sherlockians who weren't there, for the Granada series when it was new. It's hard to comprehend that, when you saw it for the first time, you almost couldn't believe what you were seeing, right? It was like the first time you're really seeing something that was very close to the page.
This is true. This is very true. And I remember watching those earlier episodes after reading the stories. And I remember just being taken aback, because at that point, I don't think I'd ever seen television that was so accurate in terms of period, in terms of costuming, in terms of feel. And again, remember, I'm thinking from the perspective of a teenager based on what history I've had to that point and what I've read outside of it. And I was just captivated by that. But what really captivated me about Holmes and reading Holmes at that age, that's an age when you're very, I guess, I don't know how to put it, as a teenager, we all go through growing pains. We all go through finding ourselves in that sense of identity and dissonance as we try to pull away from our parents and sort of shape our own identity. And I was always a kid that was sort of on the outside of everything. I was never into cliques or anything like that. And the folks that I made friends with in high school were the same way, and we keep in touch to this very day. And the terms that describe me as a kid and a teenager, weird, strange, odd, those sorts of things, it didn't bother me. It rolled off my back by 10th grade. And what I found fascinating about Sherlock Holmes, though, was not only his intellect, but again, coming back to those things I originally admired in the character, his ability to draw data together to understand and analyze his environment. And I think at the end of the day, understand people and behavior and why they behaved the way they did. And even at that age, I was interested in that behavior and a larger sense of justice. And that concept of justice grew with me as I grew from a teenager into an adult into a scholar. And that's always been that sort of common trend, especially as I was going to the graduate school and I was sort of sorting out what I wanted to do my career on and what I wanted to be and how I wanted to do it. And as I was doing data entry, but this time it was for calls on the radio plays, because, I can listen while I'm entering my data. And again, I came back to those concepts of observation, skill, science, understanding human behavior, comprehending human behavior, justice. And to me, Sherlock Holmes is probably one of the early examples in literature of not only a brilliant criminologist, and we know that Conan Doyle based his Holmes and Watson, in some extent, on Dupin, but there are other, influences that come in as well, Joe Bell. But to me, it was that sense of justice and Holmes's own sense of justice and definition of justice that was sometimes more noble and more just than Scotland Yard that drove him. And that resonated with me. And it resonated strongly, and it still does in terms of what I do and how I go about doing my work. So yes, I use his skills in my work. I have to turn off my emotions when I'm doing a forensics case. And even when I'm doing my historical research on health and 19th and early 20th century individuals, I have to turn off my emotion to analyze the folks that I study, because I see horrific things. I've seen the worst of humanity, and I've seen the best of humanity in what I do. And if I allow emotion to filter in, then it creates a problem in terms of me being able to concentrate and get my work done and be the voice of these individuals who have lost their voices because they're not here to speak anymore. Mm-hmm. And so I think that still very much drives me in terms of my relationship with Sherlock Holmes and my relationship with anthropology in my career.
It's so fascinating. It really is. I knew there had to be a link there. I knew there had to be.
It is, and it's something, I try and teach my students as well, and particularly my graduates, because graduate students, at least for me, they're the ones that are going to go and change the discipline and make it more different, or I can't say more different, I have to say different from, different from what we have, and they're going to make it better. And so each of my students, they understand the relationship that I have with Sherlock Holmes. And at the time I knew this, but my advisor also understood the relationship I had with Sherlock Holmes. My dissertation advisor, Della Cook, who came to Nerve and Knowledge, and who's a professor at Indiana University, she had told me after I submitted my dissertation, I was expecting to see more Holmes in your dissertation. There's only one quote here. I'm like, had I known that.
If I'd known I could do it, I would have put it in all over the place.
Right, it would have been everywhere.
Hey, let's take a little break, and we'll be right back after this word from our sponsor. Okay, so we're back, and we're here with Carlina de la Cova. And Carlina, I want to ask you about, if you could tell us what it is about Sherlock Holmes himself, what it is about his personality that really draws you to him.
As a person, and his sense of personal ethics and his sense of moral ethics, I think, resonates with me. And his sense of, his career and ethics within his career. There are times when we don't know what's going on in Holmes's mind, right? Like, for the most part, he seems to be this upright citizen who doesn't see class. Like, Watson is most classist. I don't want to say racist because I know he's a subject of his time, and I have to take that into consideration. But it's hard. It is so hard.
Yeah.
It is so hard, and especially being a person of color, it's really hard to say that.
I'm sure.
and a person. He's quintessentially the attitude of the British Empire at the time period. But then you have Holmes, who usually doesn't see, to me, he doesn't see social class. And he usually doesn't see race, with the exception of one story when he refers to the bruiser and, saying, I don't like the smell of you and all these horrible things. I don't understand that disconnect, but I'm not going to play the game with that one at all.
Right. It's an anomaly that we wrestle with.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. I'm sure someone out there, don't look at me, y'all. I can see some of y'all BSIs already looking at me about writing a paper about that one. That one,
I'm crossing that off the list.
Well, I mean, the yellow face is a great one. And
Oh, yeah, right.
I mean, and there have been many, both from academic literary analysis and both from, the BSI through time, members, Baker Street Irregulars who have written about it and the Baker Street Journal.
It's very difficult to reconcile those two stories.
It is. It really is.
I don't know.
I blame Sir ACD.
Yes, I do too. Who knows?
I don't know. I mean, it's like this should be coming out of Watson's mouth, not Holmes's mouth. Why is this coming out of Holmes's mouth?
But Watson wrote the story, so.
Let's see what you did there.
I don't know.
I see what you did there, shifting blame. So
I don't know. We all struggle. We all struggle with that one, and but you have to. If you look at the canon as a whole, I think what you've been saying is right. I mean, it's such an outlier that the preponderance of the canon is justice and mercy and reason and observation, all those virtues that we admire so much.
Exactly. And I think, you can read things and it's clear that, and I've talked about this before and I'm not going to go into detail about it, but it's clear that, aspects of criminal anthropology come into play, aspects of Ambrosian anthropology, which is criminal anthropology, aspects of anthropometry, and actual. So I'm thinking of Bertillon, for example, and his identification technique, which was actually based on anthropology and anthropometry, the measurement of the human body. Those aspects come into play. Scientific racism is there, but usually it's through the eyes of Watson. It's not through the eyes of Holmes. So that one story is just weird because it's always Watson. And just to translate into modern day English, yeah, he was Greek, but he spoke with an English accent. What does that mean?
I know,
was very fine and upstanding.
It's really weird.
It is.
Yeah.
But and one of the ones that my students struggle with the yellow face, and they struggle with the mother in the yellow face a lot. Well,
interesting.
Yeah,
what's the struggle?
Well, the way that she phrases things, like the daughter took after her father's people. And
that one. But what I always try to do for myself is to remind myself that this is an artifact of a certain time.
Exactly.
And I think it is sort of unfair sometimes, not just with the canon, Sherlockian canon, but other things too. I mean, sometimes I think it is short-sighted to take something out of you have to always consider the context in which this was produced, because with that context gives you an insight into the fact that this was pretty progressive given the context that it was in. And so there's a bit of credit that we can give there, despite some of the things. That's what I think anyway. You gotta,
exactly. No, and one of the things I tell them is I say, look, we can't, and I tell this to all my students, not just my students in the Sherlock Holmes class, but all of them, because we deal with it in the history of my discipline. The history of my discipline was born out of medicine, and then it became attached to eugenics and scientific racism, and that's why I can count on the number of on one hand, number of Black biological anthropologists there are, because of the horribly racist nature of the discipline.
I would imagine that within your discipline, just speaking of context, even within your discipline, the actual hands-on application of your discipline, context is everything, isn't it?
Context is everything. And this is what I tell my graduate students and my undergraduate students. We can't, forecast or project our 20th and 21st century ideals and senses of morality and senses of ideology, our own personal ideologies, onto that time period. And so because of that, what we may see as being different or not quite right in our eyes or justly unwrong had different meanings and different senses back then. And when you read the things that Abraham Lincoln said and the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and when he talks about slaves, the enslaved, when he talks African descended groups at this time period, it's not pleasant and it's not pretty. And I have to remind my students, Lincoln was he was an individual, he was a product of his time. Let's step away from that, let's step back from that and what he says, and let's get at that instead and try to find ways to tackle that as opposed to how he's saying.
Yeah.
They do find, huh?
Because, it's not just words, it's actions too, right? I mean, it's all a piece.
Exactly. No, it is. And so, we find ways to get around his very not pleasant words about African descended groups to better understand sort of his perspectives. And, it doesn't come out positive is all I'll say. And some students have their belief system about Lincoln completely disassembled. I mean, I give them Lincoln the politician, not Lincoln the person. Yeah. And so they leave realizing, okay, yeah, we shouldn't put our historical figures on a pedestal, that they are human, that they do, they do live and they breathe and they make mistakes and they do have fallacies, and that, we need to better understand them as people and look at all facets and aspects of their behavior.
And we're all products of the time that we live in, even us.
Exactly.
I always imagine that someday, 50, 100 years from now, people are going to look back at us and go, what were these people? What were they doing? I can't even imagine. I can't imagine some of it. And others things, I'm sure there's people will look back on us and think, those people were crazy, but, but it's all because we're products of the time and the place that we live.
Exactly. And I mean, Watson was a product of his time period, just like the British Empire was a product of its time period. And so what we get sort of is that unfiltered sense, I guess you could say, of feelings and thoughts and ideas from that context coming through. And then it's a matter of tearing apart that context. So you just, you can't say, even though I've said it, I say it from a position of emotion, right? And I have to step back as a scientist and as an anthropologist and pull myself away from that. And it's hard sometimes, right? It's hard.
Sure.
But, Watson was racist. But then, I have to step back from that and realize that, Watson is a product of his sort of period of history. What people believed scientifically about folks who were not British.
Right. Yes. There's the empire. Empire had a huge impact on the just the worldview. I mean, just how the lens that people saw the world through. I mean, when I was researching Sherlock Holmes for Dummies, I spent a lot of time on that. I mean, it's a short section in the book, but I spent a lot of time, maybe more time on that than a lot of other parts, because I wanted to have an honest understanding. It's easy to impugn, I think, many of the attitudes and stuff. And some of the things that went on in the empire, there was a lot of advantage taking, trade routes and that sort of thing, and sort of bringing British culture into the, these far-flung regions and sort of civilizing the natives and all that business. But it wasn't all exploitative. I mean, at least as far as intention, there was an honest sort of, we've got to bring, civilization to people. We've got, if you believe that your civilization is the highest point of existence, then you sort of feel incumbent to share it with your fellow human beings. And as misguided as that may look to, to us now, you have to understand where their head was, and
right. Their head was in doing their duty to their country, and even in many aspects their religion. And so
yes, right.
But there is one thing that is unexcusable. That's the treatment of Tonga is unexcusable.
I know, right? They shot him.
It's not just that. It's not just that, it's not just that. And it just, and again, Susan Bailey's talked about that, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle at that point was probably, as she's pointed out, exposed to images of individuals from the Andaman Islands through the archives and the collections there at Edinburgh. And he would have seen photos, he would have seen individual remains, he would have known that they weren't these short, backwards, atavistic
Yes.
individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the one thing I can't well, there are a few things in the canons, but we all have those things in the canon that we hold on to that I think if we didn't have those things that we didn't wrestle with the canon, then why would we still be wrestling with it, if that makes sense? Why would we continue to be scholars of these stories after so many years? Why would we let these stories take over our lives, our ideologies in terms of, how we define ourselves, or how we, in my case, how we go about our work, how we define justice and what is justice, and how we look for early examples of let's use that word, social justice warriors, that sort of thing.
I think it's also a testimony to the richness and the overall positive nature that these things stand out to us enough that we want to wrestle with them.
Exactly. They speak to
if we didn't care about this stuff, we wouldn't care,
Right.
You know what I mean? But because the rest of it means so much to us and speaks to us so deeply, so often, these moments like this, I think it's quite understandable that we would continue to wrestle with. We want to understand it, we want to figure it out. I think
we want to tango with it.
Yeah, right. It is. So hey, let's talk a little bit. This has been great, but we're getting on time. So let's talk about some of the things that you've done in the Sherlockian community. You mentioned Nerve and Knowledge earlier, so tell a little bit about the opportunity. I've seen you speak a number of times, and so just talk about some of the fun things you've been able to do in the hobby related.
Okay. Well, Nerve and Knowledge, I was completely surprised by and honored by the invitation from both Bob and yourself and Bob, and it was a fun night of science and medicine and anthropology in the stories, and share that, especially with members of the Midwestern contingent of Sherlockians from the illustrious clients.
For those of you who don't know Nerve and Knowledge, it was a lecture evening held at the Indiana Medical History Museum, which is they've got that sort of antique well of students sitting around with the teaching well down below, and
teaching theater.
Yeah, it's a real throwback, and it was a great night. And Carlina, Bob Katz, who we saw last week or 2 weeks ago, and Carlina both were lecturers on various anthropological aspects and medical aspects of the canon, and it was quite a night.
It was fun, and it was funny because I think I was arguing Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was definitely an anthropologist, and then Bob was arguing that Sherlock Holmes was a doctor. So they sort of
anthropologist, doctor. It was.
But as a student of medical history as well, it was just, for me, it's one of those moments. They say you have these moments in your career where you're doing something and you realize, oh my gosh, this is what it was like for people back then, and this was one of those moments for me, being in that theater, that lecturing theater, and having read about medical students through this and their letters from the early 20th century, the late 19th century. It was just an honor to be able to experience that, to be down there, be in one of those halls lecturing. Whoa.
Yeah. Well, it was for the audience, it was a chance to experience that too. Being up at that very steeply raked theater, looking down on the teaching well, And I think it was sort of a kind of a flashback moment for all of us, really. I think it was quite a night. It was great.
It was great. I had the honor to speak at the Hounds in Chicago. So the Hounds of the Baskerville, sick.
Yes.
To speak at their annual dinner, and then I was shocked. It probably was the look on my face when I was initiated as a hound. I was not expecting that. And to me, that still is a big honor. And I've spoken at the Norwegian Explorers, their last conference in Minnesota, and I've published a number of things, particularly in Chris Redmond's annotated volumes. And I have a deep gratitude for Chris for giving me this opportunity. These were my first Sherlockian publications, and I'm still very deeply indebted to Chris for that. And Chris is ever so humble as he is. It's like, so what else have I done? I've done a number of things, both inside and outside. I teach the course here on the forensics of Sherlock Holmes, hopefully gearing future generations of students towards Sherlock Holmes.
I bet that's very well attended, that class. I bet it's very popular.
Yeah, it fills. It fills. We've capped it at 70. I think one time we capped it at 120. And
Wow.
Usually it fills within 2 days, 3 days of being open. And so it's a fun class to teach. I get to, nerd out on both sides. And it's just awesome. And I've just
let me ask you this, because we're talking about you going out into the community. I think this might be a good thing to close on. So as you have gone deeper and more broadly in the Sherlockian community, what have you learned about the Sherlockian community?
I've learned a number of things, I think, and I went through a rough patch, in 2018 when my late husband died. And one of the things I've learned about the Sherlockian community, and particularly amongst Baker Street Irregulars as well, is that this is a community that will be there for you when you need them. And they are always willing to help, extend their hand, keep you in good spirits. The real definition of friendship really in this community. I mean, some of my best friends are Sherlockians, they're Baker Street Irregulars. And so, and it's funny because we can sit down and we can talk about, we can talk shop and business and scholarship about Sherlock Holmes, but we also find that we have other interests as well. But I think underlying this is a sense of fellowship. I don't know what we call it, the fellowship of the syringe or the fellowship of the 7% solution as opposed to the fellowship of the ring. I don't know.
Fellowship of the cocktail?
I don't drink, so
Not that for you.
Right? I'm the ginger ale girl, right? So I don't know. The fellowship of the oysters. There we go.
There we go.
So, but I have
that one.
I have found true friendship in the way that people define friendship, whether it be ride or dies from the generation after me, road dog from my generation, whatever you want to call the term, within the community, and amongst Baker Street Irregulars and amongst Sherlockians. And so it's really meant a lot for me, because when I hit absolute rock bottom, there were so many people that reached their hand out, come present, come do this, come do that. So I said, okay, I'm just going to throw myself out into the community. And I think for me, that was the best way to deal with, my grief and realizing that life continues, that life goes on, that you can be happy again. And so I think for me, the penultimate, I guess, bit and bob of that, and something that Tony had foresaw before he passed away. I always had this childhood dream of being a Baker Street Irregular. from the moment I learned about them when I was in, high school. And so when my name got called in January, it was a very surreal moment. And it takes a lot for me to get emotional in public. It takes a lot. And I was just, gobsmacked, to put it, that's the right word, just completely shocked and completely honored to be a part of this very vibrant community of scholars who write about these stories and interpret these stories. And I always learn something new, not only in publications that we all do, but in talking to other folks who are Sherlockians.
Oh yes, my best education has come from Sherlockian pursuits and talking to people like you. You just
yeah, it's mind-boggling. And one example I can give that I guess hits a little close to home is thinking about Bob Katz's presentation in Dayton last year about John Watson being, in the Civil War and drawing all those little aspects together, right? I wouldn't have thought about that at all. Or wanting to know what kind of, tobacco or what kind of pipe, Sherlock Holmes is using, right? I can go ask, Al Shaw. If I'm questionable about some sort of, mental diagnosis, we all know who I'm going to ask, right?
Yes.
Right? I'm going to ask Monica Schmidt. Or if I want to know about, I could keep going and going. If I want to know about some sort of pathology, or, hey, what do you think about how this looks or how this looks? What is that's really going on in the Blanche soldier? Not only can I ask Bob, but there are a number of other physicians as well within, the group so it's a very vibrant group of individuals that you just see different ways of looking at stories. So what became at one point in time a childhood pleasure that helped me sort of sort my identity and who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do, it keeps growing every year as I grow as an adult and as I grow as a person.
It never ends. It never really ends.
No, and I think I really need to write an article on, finding grief, solace, and new life in Sherlock Holmes.
Well, you know where you can send it.
Yeah, I know. I think I already promised it to you. I just need to sit down and write it.
Okay, great. Well, Carlina, this has been wonderful. We're about out of time, so I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been great, and I really look forward to seeing you in person again, hopefully sooner than later. And so I just want to say thanks, and this has been a real joy.
Well, thank you for having me, Steve. I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other in January, maybe. I don't know.
We'll see. Whenever that opportunity is, it will not be soon enough.
Yeah, I know. The whole quarantine thing is.
I know, right? Anyway, I just want to say thanks, and I do look forward to seeing you again.
Definitely look forward to seeing you again. And thank you all for listening out there.
And that's it for this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch. Again, I want to thank you for watching. And I, again, encourage you to send us your comments, your feedback, your questions, suggestions. You can put them in whatever Facebook page you're watching this program in. Put it in the comments questions. We'll find it and respond as best we can. So until next time, I just want to say thank you and goodbye.